Okay, we are live. Welcome to Boston Basic Income. The topic this week is the war economy, or how does the economy look different in times of war? So some of us read a 1966 article by a guy named Willard M. Fox. And he was actually writing his article, obviously, in the context of the Vietnam War. So he's got some interesting insights, some of which I agree with, some of which I don't. So I want to start by going around and asking people what we think about the war economy, how it differs from the economy not in times of war, and what makes it possible for us to mobilize so many resources during times of war or other crises when it does not seem possible during normal times. What's going on there? Is there like what kind of unlocks that possibility? So in terms of order of people, why don't we go Derek, then Elizabeth, then Martin, then Steve?
Well, that's a big question and goes right to the meat of it. I think that the simplest answer has to be that the spending is able to be unlocked because it is restrained. So because there are a lot of people saying that we can't spend for various other things, you create surplus capacity to be activated. And it's only because of that bubble that can be expanded into that really that sudden leap is possible. Now it would be possible if we were operating at capacity normally to suddenly redirect a lot of the consumer economy into the war production, but so I suppose that there's also that to consider. But basically, yeah, it's that there's goods and services being produced that can now be redirected towards this other purpose. The market's products are getting repurposed for the state.
Yeah, go ahead, Elizabeth.
I think I feel like a lot of it is sort of about political will, that they're like in a war economy. It's like, okay, yeah, we can spend billions of dollars on important war things because that's super important, that there's a strong political will to make that happen. Whereas often we see with other spending, it's like, oh, okay, well, we could fund some sort of government assistance for poor people, but how are we going to pay for that? And that there's often a lot of this like strong concern about, oh, how are we going to pay for it? How are we going to make this all balanced? That often seems to go away when it comes to defense spending. So I feel like certainly not the only part, but it feels like a large part of it is the political will.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Martin, go ahead.
All right, so excuse me, I'm going to agree with what's been expressed so far, but I'm going to make a comment, and this is going to sound really trite, but I really mean it. We don't understand war economy any more than we understand the regular economy, and as maybe I'm the only sort of military veteran, on the talk here right now, but it is, and sort of a kind of a crazy counterintuitive way, we handle stuff that we seem to understand, and so then the functioning of what people have already mentioned, like all the constraints are off, it's existential, therefore you do everything. So I agree with that. And but with that said, I would also say that if the author of the article that we read, or for those who did read it, if he were alive today, maybe he is, if he were here today and he were trying to understand the sort of the Middle East first Gulf War economy, Iraq War economy, Cold War economy, post long since '66, I think he'd be totally confused.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. So another question we can ask, in addition to the question of how is the war economy different from the regular economy and what makes it possible for times of war to allow us to activate so many resources, is what can we learn from what the economy looks like in times of war about how the economy always works or how it works in normal times? So Steve, you're up next.
The article seems to be trying to complain that the war spending involved printing money and so involved inevitable inflation. He talks about how the $66 is only worth less than half of the $36. And so, well, I'm wondering if that's that devaluing of the dollar is just relative to gold, which I guess back then they would worry about, or if it's just relative to other prices, in which case it doesn't matter, but we'll figure it out.
Yeah, so I think he's talking about the real purchasing power of the dollar in terms of what it can buy in the economy. So Mom, do you have initial thoughts on war economy? If you're there.
No,
Yeah.
I don't. I'm here to learn. I really feel like I'm over my head in this one, but I'm willing to try.
Yeah, well, I think as Martin pointed out, we're all over our head, and society as a whole is over
Yeah.
our heads.
I mean, I think it's relevant to what we're going through right now with the coronavirus and how are the resources being deployed or not being deployed, what's happening to, to money, to employment, to all of that stuff is coming into play. So I'm going to try to tie it in that way because I'm following that.
Yeah, and it is an interesting question because coronavirus has motivated us to mobilize a lot of resources, just as a war might.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I always think of this. Well, isn't this evidence that, and this is kind of what Derek was talking about, isn't this evidence that we had resources before that were just going unused and we weren't getting the full benefit of the economy?
Mm-hmm.
I think it's maybe also true to some extent that we can build stockpiles and we can save up resources and products and have like a buffer stock, almost like waiting, and so we can use it if we need it, like strategic reserves of personal protective equipment or just military in general. Since World War II, defense has kind of been its own industry, and this is kind of what Eisenhower kind of popularized the term military industrial complex, which is just this idea that we have a whole defense industry now. It's a thing, and we have resources. Even when we're not fighting in a war, we're putting resources toward war. But when we're actually in a war, it's even more. So it's kind of interesting that we noticed that we have this capacity that we need to activate in emergencies, in military emergencies, but maybe it's useful to always be maintaining some of that. And then there's questions of whether there's some perverse incentives there, like is the military, to what extent is the military a giant jobs program? To what extent are we using the military as a way to push money to consumers and to keep people employed and that kind of thing? Yeah, Mom, go ahead.
So in that regard too, you have to wonder, well, things like giving money to people. Now Yang's idea is coming to fruition in an emergency, and suddenly we're able to do that. And suddenly that's a good idea. So we were always able to do that. I mean, that's some of these social programs could be pursued. They are pursued in a disaster, and then they go away. So it's not like we're not able to do that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And this is a point that a lot of times people bring up when they want to advocate social programs. They're like, well, we pay for all this military stuff. How did we do that? If we can do that, why can't we pay for, supporting our population and providing benefits to our people and that kind of thing? Hi, Avi, how you doing? So we're basically just kind of introducing the topic now and getting people's initial thoughts. So if you have any initial thoughts on what makes a war economy different from the normal economy and why it makes it possible for us to mobilize so many resources, or even what we can learn from how the economy works in times of war and apply it to the economy in general?
So I would say that in a war economy, rights are more or less suspended a little bit more than in a normal economy. And that's just so that, we can make decisions a lot more quicker, because that's a lot more necessary in a war. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's I think that's right. Bethany's here. Yeah, you can go ask my mom for help. Yeah, you can go talk to my mom. I can't help you. I'm talking. Oh, you want to sit? Well, okay, that works. Bethany's gonna sit with me, but you can't hear. Yeah.
It won't let anybody else join on it too.
Everybody else is on. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, so there's lots of interesting questions, and then you could, like I always like to imagine a world with basic income, and what that world would look like. If we were in that world and we were kind of like getting the most out of the economy, maybe we would still want to have some resources going toward military, some things that are kind of saved up in preparation for war, that kind of thing. But we'd also be able to generally be activating the things that we don't usually activate until times of war, and we could be activating them toward potentially more productive purposes, because war is not really productive. It's kind of wasteful. Like, you're doing it for a reason, but at the end of the day, you're killing people and blowing things up and all of that. It's not the best use of resources, generally speaking. And we certainly don't want to use war as an excuse to kind of keep the economy going, or develop industry or that kind of thing, which I think sometimes we're a little bit in the danger of doing. And politically speaking, a lot of times politicians and leaders try to sometimes use war as a way of kind of like rallying the people and promoting nationalism and bringing prosperity to the country in a way that everybody likes and that kind of thing. So does anyone have any more comments before we get to quotes from the article? Okay, let me see if I can bring it up on the sharing. Oh, here we go. Here it is. Okay, can I see? Yes. War is clearly a waste. Waste of the lives of the killed, waste of the physical well-being of the maimed, waste of the time of the men who are fortunate enough to come home safe and sound despite their loss of productive years. And it is a waste of munitions consumed and stockpiled, unused, as well as the capital goods that are worn out in producing them. So this is basically just what I was saying. War is a waste. And in an ideal world, we would want to avoid war as much as possible. So if we're creating incentives for going to war that increase the chances that we go to war, that seems like a bad thing. We wouldn't want to structure our society in any way such that people would want to go to war even more, or governments would want to go to war even more. So anyone have any thoughts about that? I've got a lot of quotes, so we can keep blasting right through these.
So I have a comment that I'll make on that, and this will be a little bit anecdotal. I apologize. So my brother graduated just a year behind me. We're both West Point graduates, and long story short, we both deployed to the Middle East for the first Gulf War. He got bounced out because of a kidney problem, and he made the comment to the doctor who treated him that if he had to swim, well, okay, I'm making this up a little bit. If he had to crawl back to the Middle East to be a part of the first Gulf War, he was going to do it. And so he told the doctor, bury my kidney problem in my record. I don't want anybody to know that I have this kidney problem, because they'll put me behind the desk. Look, what I'm trying to describe a little bit, actually, he, a special forces officer who did not participate in the Grenada operation. And as he put it to me, the business about getting kicked out of the first Gulf War, if you want to call it that, he just wasn't going to tolerate it after he missed Grenada. Okay, so I'm being a little facetious, but not too much. And actually, he did say that.
So this is by way of saying that.
To
Yeah, go ahead.
express is this idea that for all the deploying of all the risks, I mean, it sounds crazy, but there is this sort of embracing this ultimate conflict, WWF on steroids, or whatever that sort of thing is, and you can't completely dismiss that. I mean,
yeah, I think that's right. You can't dismiss
we
that.
like to think, we're peaceful and peace is our objective. And I would argue that military do that a fine point, and you could, if you've read, and to keep the peace. But there's always this little thing gnawing at you that all this training, you want one day to use it.
Right.
Or you want to validate it. And I've heard the exact same expression from the deputy commander of the cyber command about the training that they do for cybercom warriors, cyber fighters, if you want to call it that, that there's this slight tension of they want to use those skills at some point.
So by the way, Martin, you're not cutting out like you were last week, but you're at least on my end, I'm having trouble.
Anyway.
You've got some distortion coming through on your end. So I don't know if there's something you can adjust or, yeah. But I think that's a great point.
There's a little bit of,
Let me,
I want to say just
yeah, so we can ask the question, to what extent do people just kind of naturally need to fight or be in wars or have that kind of experience, that kind of aggression, competition, that kind of thing. And then, to what extent is the desire to go to war by an individual kind of like an internalized social incentive? So I fully believe that your brother, felt this way and felt very strongly this way. Would he feel this way if society didn't reward people for feeling this way? Is another question. And then, if it's just like a human nature kind of thing, are there ways to redirect that in ways that aren't so wasteful? So Steve, go ahead.
I was thinking that that people sort of become comfortable with the status quo. The normal life, the status quo is okay with lots of people. And then something like a war happens or a pandemic, and people just want to get back to the status quo. And they think that the war or pandemic is not going to happen too often, so extraordinary printing of money and extraordinary efforts are needed. Which is fine, except actually the status quo is not great for everybody. But as long as the status quo is great for, I guess, a majority, but not for the poor, then the majority decides that the status quo is just what we want to get back to. And once we're back to normal and poor people are just regular poor people again, then we can stop spending money.
Yeah, so that's another interesting point, and it's related to the idea that in times of war, a lot of times we innovate and come up with new ways to, structure our financial system or structure our society, and some of those things kind of carry over, and some of them don't. But it's interesting to see how, we have a war and we're spending all this money and we're using all these resources, and then after the war is over, there's this phenomenon of, okay, now we have this kind of peace dividend, which is kind of like the George Bush Senior, Margaret Thatcher term from the 90s, early 90s. The idea that, when the Cold War is over, now all those resources we were spending, they can go toward our people. So I think there is this kind of like progress is made during times of war, because you realize you have all these resources, and then you can suddenly start using. To some extent, we go back to the way it was before, and poor people just become regular poor people again. But to some extent, some stuff sticks. It would be nice if we could get some of that stuff without having to go to war and waste all these resources in order to make it happen. Yeah, Avi, go ahead.
I mean, on the other hand, I feel like, me personally, I'd worry that, the military industrial complex would have a hard time giving up that extra money and power that it's given during a wartime economy. So oftentimes, I mean, you even see this during non-war events where they try like everything to justify the bloated military budget. So I kind of worry that they'll unnecessarily try to like manufacture bombs or say that, oh, even in peacetime, we need this bloated budget.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And that was the whole origin of the military industrial complex too, right? It used to be that we just took our private industries and activated them for war purposes, and, shifted what they were producing from, I guess, plowshares to swords or whatever. And then, we got to the point after World War II where it kind of stuck around afterwards. I guess we immediately went into the Korean War, into the Vietnam War. So that helped kind of facilitate that transition as well. But now we have this defense industry. Yeah, Mom, go ahead. You there?
So
Yeah.
I'm actually circling back to Martin's anecdote. And I actually have another anecdote, which is because I came up during the Vietnam War protests and all of that, a lot of the questioning had to do with, well, what are we doing there? Why do we have to do this? And I remember having a conversation with somebody, and we agreed there shouldn't be war. And I said, yeah, but why is there war? Why do we even have soldiers? Why do we have ammunition? And that sort of stopped me. He said, well, I kind of know why we have those things. I mean, we have to protect ourselves. So, I would ask, the way you talk about the economy, Alex, as being for the consumer, you could argue that, looking at an historical sweep, that it's built to protect and go to war. I mean, it's kind of built around that whole idea. Territorialism, what we talked about with, I forget his name, the economist who talked at Harvard and talked about territorialism in the
Carl
early
Weidecrest.
Yeah. It may be just kind of an unavoidable consequence of being human. So the idea of an economy being anything but designed to protect and go to war is the anomaly and not the regular economy.
Well, I mean, I think the economy is designed and structured to do a lot of things. And I think, the military industrial complex basically shows that, at least part of it is geared towards war, or being prepared for war, or putting resources into preventing war and that kind of thing. But that doesn't mean it's the whole economy, right? The defense industry in the United States is a really huge thing, but it's not the whole thing. And I think Avi was right that it can be hard to get out of it once we're in it, because now you've got all these people whose jobs and livelihoods depend on there being a military, and depend on industry being, producing things for the military. So we to some extent, we do become dependent on the military to keep the economy going. And it's hard to just say, oh, we don't need soldiers, we don't need military, blah, blah, blah. And that would be a really scary thing for a lot of these people if we ended up in a situation where suddenly there's, a global peace, and it starts to become more obvious that we don't need war anymore. And now a lot of people are like, well, this is my life, what am I going to do? And that goes from the soldiers who have been indoctrinated and internalized, the desire to be soldiers and go to war and use their training. And it includes, the scientists and everyone who work at, Lockheed Martin and other industries that are, supplying, industrial products and technology and stuff for the military. So yeah, I think to some extent, to some extent, that's a hurdle we need to get past. And my hope is that basic income, basic income can do a lot of things, but one of the things it will do is it'll prevent people from being afraid of losing their livelihoods. If there's a big shift in the economy, and it doesn't have to be just a shift away from war, it can be any kind of shift. There's a lot of things we're stuck doing. The military and the defense industry is just one of them. There are a lot of jobs that we're trying to protect. We don't necessarily need to build our own cars in America. We didn't necessarily need to bail out GM after 2008, but we did because it protected all of those American jobs. Maybe there would have been good reasons to do it anyway, but I think it's hard to tell when everyone's talking about jobs all the time. Yeah. Anyone have any more thoughts before we move on to the next quote? Okay, here we go. Why is this so hard to find? How to finance a war, there it is. Enough has been said to indicate the politically courageous and morally correct way to finance wars. That is to impose, insofar as possible, and that is quite far, the money costs where the real costs fall anyhow. That is to tax away substantially all the incremental earnings of the civilian population as these earnings accrue. To write an equitable tax law that would accomplish this would tax the ingenuity of economists and tax lawyers, but with sufficient ingenuity and intelligence, it might be done. So here, basically what he's advocating for is he's saying that society is paying the cost of the war. People are paying the cost of the war. Our production is going into the war effort instead of into consumer goods. And he's saying the right thing to do is to make that transparent, to make that obvious by taxing the consumers, by showing them explicitly that they're paying the cost. Now, I think you can kind of say, okay, yes, this seems more honest, and it shows people that they're actually paying a cost anytime they go to war and that kind of thing. But I think it's also true, kind of what we were talking about before, that war activates resources that we just weren't activating before. So a lot of times, especially in the modern wars in like Iraq and Afghanistan and stuff, our consumer economy is just doing what it does, and then the war is doing something on top of that. And in some ways, because the war provides incomes for people who are soldiers or involved in the military-industrial complex, that kind of thing, it actually, in some ways, boosts the consumer economy. So I think, his description here is more similar to what you would see if we had a basic income already. If we were already maximizing the potential of the economy, then what we would need to do in order to free up resources for the war effort is we would have to make it explicit that fewer resources are going into the consumer economy, fewer resources are going toward the people, and that would mean taxing the use of resources that need to go to the war, or even banning the use of certain things like copper or whatever. There were no copper pennies in 1943 because we needed the copper for the war effort, so we made steel pennies. And there's a lot of things we have to kind of give up in times of war. And we haven't really been giving up those things with Iraq and Afghanistan. And people, they live their lives. They don't feel like they're a country at war, not in the sense that they did during World War II. And this was somewhat true during Vietnam. During Vietnam, we at least had the draft, and that kind of like put it in people's consciousness. But kind of like the day-to-day, economy, especially now, it doesn't feel like a war economy. It just feels like an economy. And then one of the things we do is we go to war, or we fight wars, that kind of thing. So I think, if we had a basic income in place, that alone would make it more explicit that people are giving something up in order for us to go to war, because we actually have to pull resources away from the normal domestic consumer economy, instead of just having a permanently shrunken or below capacity consumer economy, and then just doing this war thing as an extra thing. The war thing would actually feel like a cost. So I think that's I think right now, you know, you don't have to tax in order to go to war. You can just borrow a ton. And that's because, you know, we've got the extra resources to do it because we're not benefiting consumers to the fullest extent possible. Anyone have any comments on that?
Yeah, I think it's a term
So,
called the
yeah.
forever war, where it's
Yeah.
like, I mean, we've been in, what was it, Afghanistan for probably longer than I've been alive, which is pretty concerning, to say the least.
Yeah, Martin, go ahead. Or whoever
Yeah,
was
so I
talking.
just
Yeah,
wanted
Martin.
to, yeah, sorry. I had a notion a while back, or a number of years ago, and again, you might say I'm kind of a military guy, but I had this notion that we should try to figure out and tax oil in this country to cover the military cost of defending the supplies of oil. And I would suggest, and you know, that what you're really after is transparency. Not because it's not transparent today because it's evil. It's actually, it's a little bit more like in this article, like, okay, transparency, but
Oh, sure.
that'd be
Oh,
really
yeah, yeah.
complicated. How could we
It
do
was
it?
hard to find this time.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, so I think that you could notionally at least think about that more broadly. So you could say, okay, if the war in Afghanistan, if the 03 invasion of Iraq or whatever, it's buying a certain amount of security. So then you somehow get, you know, you think of itemizing your taxes if you're, you know, if you're at a certain income level and different, you know, things going on. Think in terms of also an itemized sort of tax statement that says your tax dollars bought you this much oil security, this much anti-terrorism security, this much. And again, the article is correct. Conceptually, that's easy to sort of say. To actually do it would be really hard.
Yeah.
Uh, but the transparency, if
I think we lost you, Martin, but I'm going to go to Derek, and feel free to raise your hand if you have more to say. Go ahead, Derek.
There seems to be this desire to make sure that on the author, the part of the author, to make sure that the civilians properly kind of feel the cost of war, which they're not feeling. But in context, what's interesting about that is that it seems that there's been a kind of developmental process wherein we've mastered the art of doing precisely the opposite. We've started to get really good at keeping the war industry growing and sustainable, and actually not taking off too much of the private consumer sector, so that the private consumer sector can keep flourishing, fueling this war economy to a large extent. And so if you can look at the modern wars, they sort of solved that problem. We can use this type of war against a low-level adversary, right? And we can now keep up a constant war labor program that's simultaneously kind of pumping money into the economy without taking too much of it. If you look at past wars, in the old days, this was much more difficult. We hadn't figured out how to do this. And so the civilian population would be much more destitute. Compare the Civil War and the early World Wars, where there was a lot of inflation, right? Now we don't have that because we figured out exactly how not to do what the author is suggesting, which is make the civilian population feel the pain of that. But at the same time, there's still, this is only possible because we're not doing the best that we can to maximize benefit to the consumer economy. It's going into war production, or it's not being used.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it's also true to some extent that part of the reason we're able to get away with this is that we're keeping our people permanently destitute, or more destitute than they otherwise would be. And, you know, the reason we don't see the costs of war, a big part of it is because we aren't allowing ourselves to see the benefits of peace. Yeah. Anyone have any more thoughts before we go on to the next quote? Hi, Bethenny, you have a thought?
Yeah, I guess an example of what everyone's been talking about is, of course, the instinct we all have that World War II helped us get out of the Great Depression, which is like kind of ironic because it was using up a lot more resources and burning up a lot more resources, and yet somehow it seems like that's a stimulus. So you clearly have to have room in the economy for that to happen. And then I guess the other question I had is like, what do you think the author has in mind? Like, what do you think he thinks is funding it now that would then be changed to taxes? You see what I mean? Like, what do you think he thinks is the funding mechanism that isn't getting internalized?
Yeah, so I think what he sees is that inflation is, so he sees the money printing. So he sees that as causing inflation and being kind of a hidden tax that everyone's paying. So what he wants is he wants to make that tax explicit. I would question whether the amount of inflation that he sees in the economy exactly corresponds to, how many resources are being put into the Vietnam War and stuff like that. I don't think he has the picture quite right.
And how would he explain like the World War II example?
Well, I would say that he would say that during World War II, the consumer economy was mainly shut down. That money couldn't buy the things it would ordinarily buy. That, there were some products you could buy, but a lot of the stuff was just going toward the war effort. And he would say that we've issued these war bonds as a way of getting people to spend their money buying something that actually doesn't take up any resources. We talk about war debt as a way of the government borrowing in order to pay for the war, but you can't, borrow something that doesn't exist. What you're really doing, you're not like borrowing money and the money magically buys more stuff. It's that you're paying people not to spend money. You're paying them you're saying, we'll pay you some interest and you buy these things that will earn you interest, and then you'll earn a profit after the war if we win the war, right? But you're not buying the stuff that uses resources in the economy, and those resources can now go toward the war. And I think that's basically right. I think he would also argue that there was inflation during that time as well. Obviously, you couldn't really measure prices because the market was being so interfered with that, the price mechanism was not working efficiently anyway. So it was kind of hard to tell whether the economy was really booming during World War II. I mean, it was booming in the sense that we were producing a lot of stuff for the war, but it wasn't, necessarily the case that people were more prosperous during that time than they otherwise would be in the domestic economy. Yeah, Derek, go ahead.
Yeah, there's like a paradox there, but I think what's happening is you're spinning up productive capacity that can then be used after the you're spinning up productive capacity that can then be used after the war. So it's true that before the war, there's just stuff's not being used and resources and people are going idle. And then during the war, you spin them up, you get them active, but they're deferring a lot of the benefit they're earning is being deferred to the future. The war ends, and now we can have the 1950s. And so, yeah, that's how I would describe it.
Yeah, I think that's right. Anyone have any more comments before we go on to the next quote? Yeah, Martin, go ahead.
Yeah, so Alex, I just wanted to, I think there's a tendency when you think of military industrial complex, or as I like to think of it as the military industrial congressional complex, there's always a connotation of nefarious. And I would suggest that if you want a sort of a different outcome, consider also that sometimes these things, there's not a nefarious element, so that if you address it as, if you get rid of the nefarious element, you've solved your problem. You haven't solved your problem. And so let me just offer as a sort of an example. The air war over Kosovo, which is probably not something that most of us think about. An element in the air war over Kosovo was the frustration on the American side with how fast the other NATO allies ran out of smart bombs, smart munitions. And so when you think of the sort of the American industrial capacity, that capacity, if you can get somebody else like Saudi Arabia to buy stuff from you when you don't need to use it, the capacity is available for you when you think that in some future conflict or the conflict that you're trying to avoid because you have the demonstrated capacity. There's a logic, you might not like it, right? But there's a logic to sort of thinking, oh, we need to have this industry. We try to get other people outside of us to sort of pay for it by buying our stuff, it boosts our GDP and economy. And so the point I'm simply trying to make is it's not always nefarious. There's a logic there that, so you just have to sort of think about, well, do you change the,
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think to some extent we are. So there's a few different things. I think one thing is the thing I was talking about before, that maybe our GDP was lower than it could be if we were activating our full economy, and then the war actually allows us to activate it up to a higher level because we previously weren't. And then there's also the issue of it's good to have it's good to, well, not necessarily good, but it's prudent to be prepared to defend your country, that kind of thing. It's prudent to have a standing military and to have resources that are maybe not activated to the full potential they would be in a time of war, but activated enough that you would have something like a military industrial complex that wasn't necessarily nefarious in any way. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that right now in our economy, we have this incentive to maybe make that military industrial congressional complex larger than it needs to be, because we are getting outsized benefits because of the fact that we weren't previously activating our economy to the full potential. So I think there's all of that, and I think there's room for a standing military. There's room for all of these things. It's just when we start using this stuff for a purpose other than kind of what its intended purpose is. Oh, and then also there's the idea that if you borrow now and spend money and get resources from other countries to help you in your war, maybe there's a sense in which you could pay them back later. So you're kind of making a promise to everyone, like, hey, once the war is over, you're going to get something back. So it's a way to kind of pull more resources in that maybe you wouldn't want to do on kind of an ongoing basis. So maybe there is more stuff you can activate from other countries or other people who want to support the war and put resources in temporarily, and you're promising to sacrifice more after the war, that kind of thing. So that's also a valid thing. Then you are kind of borrowing against the future, which is valid as long as there's someone to give you the resources right now. Yeah, Avi, go ahead.
Yeah, I would kind of agree with that last point, where a lot of times a singular nation can benefit from war because they steal resources from another country, or they steal market share from another country that could be a competitor in kind of like a neutral space. So while like the global economy would obviously suffer during warfare, you could have like a country like the US taking resources from a certain country or whatever. So there's also that argument to be made.
Yeah, I think that's right. And we can't forget that, at least some of the time, there's reasons why you're going to war. Maybe you're fighting to be able to have your country, to have your economy, to protect your economy, that kind of thing. So there's benefits that are more kind of like directly related to why the war is being fought as well. Yeah, Bethenny, go ahead.
First, you should unblock my video, which you blocked. And I can't turn it back on.
Is it blocked? I thought I just turned it off.
Yeah, but I can't turn it back on. You have to turn it back on.
I don't know how to do that. Oh, wait,
You can only turn it off.
I can ask you to start your video.
Okay, let's try that.
But I can't turn your
camera
on.
That worked. Okay. Yeah, I guess I was just thinking, I was curious what you think about sort of standard economic arguments that are similar to what Avi said. So for example, what I learned on a quick video was just that after World War II, for example, the productive capacity of so many countries was really hurt, but the American productive capacity was relatively intact because we didn't have a lot of bombing in our own country, and that really helped. From the perspective of this video, that helped our economy because we were able to sell to all of these people. So I know that's very different from how you tend to think about economies, because you still have a lot of world productive capacity destroyed. Like, is that in any sense net beneficial in your view to the country that kind of remains with its productive capacity intact? Is there a competitive element there that fits in with how you think about economics, or not? I guess I'm interested in how you think about that.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly better to be the country that doesn't have your productive capacity destroyed. But I would say that if everyone else didn't have their productive capacity destroyed, then you have an opportunity to use your productive capacity to go towards something else other than helping these other countries rebuild after a war. Now, as we've set things up, we kind of depend on producing things and depend on exporting things to provide incomes to consumers. So in the context of how we structure our economy, it feels like, oh, there's people who need to buy our stuff over there. That's a good thing for our economy. But the way I would frame it is that part of it is, it's not necessarily, if they're buying our stuff, that means we're buying less of our stuff. And that's not inherently a good thing. And if we had a basic income, then we'd be able to buy more of our own stuff. Maybe we still would want to help the European countries rebuild, but that's a cost. We're putting resources into helping them rebuild. So I would say that it wasn't just like a clear benefit that the European infrastructure was destroyed and we had to help them rebuild it. Yeah, Bethenny, go ahead.
I was just going to say, maybe on the political level, it was helpful for a long term, which had some economic effects too, like building up Germany and Japan in particular in ways that they became our allies. But that's a little bit different than the economics, straightforward economics.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's ways to help people out and to forge alliances that do not involve beating them down first. And that would be my preference. Yeah. Anyone else have any more thoughts before we move on to the next quote? Okay, here we go. I think yes. So this is fancy because I had to shrink the size of the text to make it all fit. Where is it? There it is. Okay. Obviously, no businessman in his right mind prefers war orders to normal orders from his regular customers, for he knows that they are temporary and largely illusory, and that reconversion to peacetime activities is time-consuming and expensive, and carries the risk of losing position in the market. Yet, by a combination of persuasion, appeals to patriotism, veiled threats of coercion, and bidding a high enough price, government can get what it wants in the market. So yeah, I mean, I think this is a good point, and we can do this. And like one thing we can do is get existing businesses to switch over to doing something new. Another thing we can do, which we've been doing now for over half a century, is to have businesses that are always doing war stuff. But another thing we can do is that if we actually do activate the economy to its full potential, then there are more businesses that are already producing that are available to switch over to support the war effort or to produce for the war effort. Yeah, go ahead, Bethenny.
This speaks to something that I think we might have talked about with the COVID-19 meeting, or at least it's been confusing me, which is this question of, does this actually happen? Because right now people are concerned in a similar kind of emergency that the government won't be able to get as much of what it needs from industry in terms of ventilators and protective equipment without invoking sort of special, take control of the companies themselves kinds of orders. I don't know the details of them. That seems different from what this quote is saying. And I guess I wondered if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, so one of the things he does mention is bidding a high enough price to get them to switch over. And I think that's the way I would typically, that's kind of like the first line of action that I would want the government to take, is just to say, hey, we're willing to pay for you to switch over to producing bombs or ventilators, as the case may be, right? So then you let the government is interfering with the market or influencing the market by participating in the market. They're saying, okay, we're willing to pay X amount for all this stuff, or we need all this stuff. Who's willing to produce it for the cheapest, or that kind of thing? And then you get the normal market activity that rallies around producing whatever needs to be produced. And by the same token, you might want to tax the use of resources that is not going toward the war effort. So, if you really need more copper for the war effort, you could tax the use of copper in consumer goods, right? So you're not directly decreeing that the private sector can't make things out of copper. You're just making it so expensive for them that they're going to find some other material to use or something like that. So I would generally, advocate for those kinds of approaches.
And just to follow up, so if that's not happening, is part of the issue that the states are actually the ones that are trying to buy the things rather than the federal government as of now, or I'm not really following.
Yeah, so I guess coronavirus is a little bit different because the military is always going to be a federal government type thing, representing the whole country or fighting for the whole country. Whereas, with coronavirus, individual states can fend for themselves if they need to, or they can try to fend for themselves. And I think it's a little bit messy what's happening right now because we're doing kind of a mishmash of a lot of these different things, like ordering companies to produce different things or paying higher prices, or there are various regulations that are restricting which supply chains governments have access to versus the people. And obviously all the other countries in the world are having the same problem and that kind of thing. I think what I would have preferred to see would be kind of like a more centralized effort from the federal government, and kind of like a willingness to pay whatever it takes to distribute the resources as needed to the states, or maybe even providing funding to the states directly, allowing them to figure out what they need individually, because different states are in different situations, that kind of stuff. I don't think we're handling it optimally right now. And like having had a better reserve or better preparation, not cutting back funding for the CDC over the last however many years, that kind of thing. Having, like just like we have a standing military, have kind of this standing facility for being prepared for a pandemic or an epidemic, that kind of thing, or having more of that. So there's a lot that maybe we could have done better. Yeah. Anyone have any additional thoughts?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
my 2 cents on this is that the businessman, where he says, wouldn't in their right mind prefer orders because, eventually the war ends. I'll use a little bit of current history, which is a kind of into AI, want no regulation at all. They want the Wild West. And I think the reality is that's not true.
Oh, I think we lost you there, Martin. But yeah, so you're saying that the people who are developing AI, to some extent, are seen as wanting freedom to do whatever they want, but then and I think this is true, that a lot of them are calling for us to be smart about AI and not letting it get out of hand and that kind of thing. I think both of those things are true. And I think it's the reason why it seems weird that AI developers want both things. There's a few reasons, and one of them is that they don't speak with one voice. There's different people that are saying different things. And then another thing is that if you understand how the technology works, then you understand what needs to be allowed in order to make progress in your research, in order to build better AI and develop the technology and stuff like that. You don't want too many restrictions on that kind of stuff, but maybe you do want restrictions on other things. But it can be hard to tease that apart if you're not like in it, in part of the industry. Is that kind of what you're getting at, Martin?
Yeah, so I don't know where I dropped off. My signal here is crazy as soon as I start contributing. Yeah, so my point is that predictability, that all these companies, to where they can have predictability, the cost of regulations, in a sense, they can pass that off, right? As long as it's applied to everybody. So yeah, they do like predictability. And I'll give another twist on this. Today at it's a regular meeting call at Harvard called Managing the Atom, and it's all about all things nuclear. So the speaker gave a number of something 100+ million that lobbyists are spending to what you might call lock in what they believe will be the Trump nuclear upgrade, if you want to call it that, the multi-trillion-dollar program. And if you follow it, you know what it is. And there again, you know, you might look, okay, lobbyists, they're nefarious. But, you know, another way of looking at it is they're doing kind of what you'd really expect. They're simply trying to lock in predictability. You might not like the system, but it, you know, once I guess I'm sort of, you know, the champion of it's not all nefarious.
Yeah.
It makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And I think it's useful to lock things in general if that
The
provides the
underlying
stability and that provides the incentive for
system so that this.
Sorry. Yeah, so I think you know, and the same argument could be made in cases of war. You know, the author here, Willard M. Fox, you know, he's saying that businesses don't want to take war orders, or businessmen don't want to take war orders because of all the uncertainty involved. But if the government makes promises or makes commitments to buy X amount of whatever, no matter what happens with the war effort, or makes a credible promise, then the businesses are more likely to accept that order, right? And you know, if the government wins the war, they'll be able to make good on that promise. If they lose the war, then you know, the civilian business probably would have ended up having problems anyway, because you're doing business in a country that just lost a war. So I don't know that you can avoid the risk by avoiding taking war orders, or avoid the uncertainty by avoiding taking war orders. And if you take the war orders and you know there's a credible promise there, and this is true of coronavirus too, right? Like if the government said we want to buy, you know, enough ventilators to make it profitable for you to switch over all your production to ventilators and then switch back when we don't need it anymore, then you know a business that wants to profit is gonna take that order. They're gonna want to produce all those ventilators. Yeah. Anyone have any more thoughts? Okay, we will move on to the next quote. Moreover, it is plain that there is no possible way to use the same bit of steel today, both in a mortar and a mortar. Every ton of steel, every pound of copper, every ounce of silver that goes into war material and is consumed or destroyed is lost, at least for the present, and probably irrevocably. Hence, it follows that every day each man devotes to military service, and each machine and each pound of material that is used up for military purposes are completely lost to the civilian economy and to the satisfaction of the wants and needs of the civilian population as consumers. So yeah, I mean, I think this is just kind of hammering home the point that war is wasteful, that if you take a step back and look at the actual resources involved, assuming your economy is efficient and that it's doing what it's supposed to be doing for the people, then it can't be anything other than a cost for consumers. It can't be a benefit to consumers because you're literally wasting resources. So if you've structured your economy in such a way that it is a benefit to consumers, then it must have been the case that they weren't benefiting from those resources anyway, or something like that. Yeah, Bethenny, go ahead.
I completely agree with you, except that if it's somehow like a war of conquering or something like this. I mean, now we don't tend to have that kind of war as much, but like the Mongols, yeah, like they burned a lot of resources, but they got way more resources than they burned, right? So traditionally, like historically, it's been a gamble more than just a burn of resources from the individual country's perspective, because they're trying to like go exploit a whole bunch of other people's resources basically and take them for themselves. So I mean, I think this point is generally right in terms of like the modern wars that we've seen, but I guess I just wanted to bring up that caveat. And net across the globe, of course, it's like a waste of resources net, you know, across all the countries involved for sure.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. You know, we're kind of comparing war to no war rather than comparing war to what's going to happen to you if you don't fight. So maybe you're not going to be able to conquer all these other civilizations that have these resources, or maybe it's a war you're fighting to prevent being conquered yourself, right? So if you lose that war, then that's a real cost as well. Yeah, Derek, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with both of those points because you can get you're making a wager on a long-term benefit, either not being conquered or conquering someone else. But the point he's making is really good, a really good one. It's the part of the article I like where he's stressing that he's seeing through the rhetoric about how people usually talk about war finance, because he's stressing that you're not borrowing from the future, you're borrowing from current present prosperity. And that's a really important point because it's not the way people typically talk about borrowing to pay for war.
Yep, I think that's a good point. Anyone have any more thoughts before the next quote?
Yeah, so that's, I'm sort of thinking that what war, any other kind of competition, it just changes the winners and losers. So anyway, it just changed who the winners and losers are. So you could look at somebody like Lyndon Johnson and the escalation in Vietnam, since this is 66 anyway. And that escalation, you could argue, at least in part, was about Johnson wanting, Johnson was seeking loss, evading loss, so loss reversion. What do you call it? So, and so he believed that that a communist takeover in Vietnam would be tagged to him as having lost in this competition against communism. So he had loss aversion, and so he acted the way he did in that escalation. So again, it's just shifting around who the winners or losers are. He perceived that he would be tagged as the loser, therefore he escalates in Vietnam, and in general, war can kind of do that.
Yeah, I think it's right that war changes who the winners and losers are, but I would say that that's not all it does. So, even if someone's a winner and someone's a loser, it could be that on net, people as a whole have lost, or countries as a whole have lost, or the world as a whole has lost. And this is the difference between, like a zero-sum game and a negative-sum game. And I would say that under normal circumstances, war is a negative-sum game. But then we've got this weird phenomenon where countries maybe are not reaching their full potential and holding themselves back, except in times of war. And then maybe war can turn into a positive sum game, even because of how broken our economy is, that kind of thing. So Bethenny, go ahead.
I think Martin's point also brings up the principal agent problem and who decides to go to war and who pays the cost. And so if we're thinking about why countries go to war, even though it's wasteful, so the leader might accrue benefits by staying in office or being more popular, even though the whole economy as a whole is doing worse, or the citizens are dying or whatever, because the leader is not really paying most of that cost and might be accruing a lot of the benefit. And this is even stronger in non-democracies probably, or historically. But I think this is a big issue, is war is wasteful and there's a huge amount of cost, but the decider is not necessarily the one who pays that cost.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And it's funny because in the article, Willard Fox is saying he wants the people to bear more of the cost so that they decide not to go to war, that kind of thing. And that can work maybe if you're in a perfect democracy and the people have influence over the leader or something like that. But if the leader is not the one bearing the cost and the people are the ones bearing the cost, then that might not be a very good way to prevent war. So maybe it depends on some kind of democratic structure to society or something like that. Yeah, Derek, go ahead.
So if I understand Alex's point in general, it's that we've rigged the system so that we've created artificial benefits to going to war, whereas normally it would be closer to a zero-sum or a negative-sum game. But we've rigged it so that many actors, not everyone, but many actors in our domestic economy win by going to war. At the beginning of the article, he points out that it seems like Vietnam is being fought neither to win nor to lose. And he has a problem with this. He feels like, well, the goal is to win. We should just win it, right? But what is winning is, well, we're getting all of these benefits. We're getting all of the benefits of putting together making lots of profit for large sectors of this military industrial complex. And when you're fighting a foe like that, it's very different from what Alex and Bethenny were talking about earlier, where maybe you win, maybe you lose. It's a wager against the future. If the U.S. is fighting an enemy, a foreign enemy that isn't actually posing an enormous domestic threat, they can kind of keep fighting that war. And so it becomes a really, you're not fighting to win, you're not fighting to lose, you're fighting to keep up this kind of labor program. And you can keep doing that indefinitely, it seems.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. There's an incentive to keep the wars going. Eddie, go ahead.
So talking about borrowing for war versus taxing for war, I just wanted to add that on the one, the point was made that if you tax for war, then you're kind of paying for it upfront in terms of other things that the country could consume at the present time versus going to war. And I wanted to just add to that, point out that present consumption and future consumption are always linked by the addition of capital, because if you they can always be traded off against each other. When you save instead of consuming, you can invest that capital into, say, building more factories or more technology or whatever, and having more consumption in the future. So those things are always linked by a kind of a present future trade-off. And then the other point I wanted to make was that the situation around World War II versus the situation in the 60s versus the situation right now are all different. And I think the situation right now is similar to during World War II or prior to World War II, where we have very slack aggregate demand and very low, a lot of idle capital running around, which you can see in terms of very low returns in the financial markets and very low interest rates. And so I think I agree with Alex from a slightly different angle that part of the problem around prior to World War II and currently is that we don't have a UBI, so we're not generating enough aggregate demand. So we all have all this capital lying around, and so it ends up looking as if it's a net benefit when you employ everyone to go to war, when in fact the net benefit is simply that you employed them, and you could have employed them to do anything, go to Mars or anything. And that would all work out to help the economy versus the 60s or 70s, where we were running very close to productive capacity. And it's interesting that the article was written in 66 and later in the 70s, we did indeed get a lot of inflation because we, societal spending kind of outrun the growth of capital and the growth of productive capacity.
Yeah, so I certainly agree with the first part of what you said, or with most of what you said. I'm not convinced that we were running at full productive capacity in the 60s, and I think there's ways to have inflation even when you're running an output gap. So I think that might be a debate for a separate day. But I think your insights are spot on. For we have excess capacity, but it looks like we're able to do more when we go to war. It looks like war is enabling us to do more when really the fact is previously we were doing less than we otherwise could have. Yeah, Avi, go ahead.
So I would largely agree that most warfare is a net negative, but I feel like sometimes you could have what's called like a soft war where there isn't actually like militaristic fighting, in which case both parties kind of like spur the other to drive innovation. And the event that I'm thinking of in specific is like the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the US. And I would argue that the Cold War spawned so much innovation that it could be argued that it was like a net positive, between like the space race, GPS, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and I think that's true. And the question is, how do we spur that innovation? How do we incentivize that innovation without making it about war? Now, obviously, if it's a Cold War, it's not as costly in terms of wasting resources, that kind of thing. But it's still true that after the Soviet Union fell, we were talking about peace dividend and all of the resources that we were putting into the military that could now go towards other things. So the Cold War did inspire a lot of innovation, but I think it also wasted a lot of resources at the same time, even though we weren't necessarily actively fighting. So I feel like there's a way to do even better than having a Cold War inspire the innovation. Yeah, go ahead, Avi, if you have another comment, or you're just putting your hand back down. So anyone have any more thoughts before we go on to the next quote?
Yeah, so I just offer that one could consider how many companies these days are engaging in stock buybacks and perhaps even using leverage to do that. And it may be simplistic, but some would say that a company will buy its stock back. It'll use its cash to buy back its stock because it can't think of anything better to do with the cash. In other words, make a new product or a new service that would be more profitable. So I would suggest that there may be a little bit of a deficit of creativity that figures into how the economy performs. And from a wartime economy sort of point of view, is it does sort of get people acting very creatively. It's a shame that that's the mechanism by which that creativity gets created. So look for another method of sort of inspiring or driving that innovation and creativity.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think it's true that with stock buybacks, companies can't find something more profitable to do. They're always going to want to do, the most profitable thing, or what they think is the most profitable thing. And if they think that's a stock buyback, they're not. They don't think they can profit in some other way. Now, I don't know that it's an absence or lack of creativity that's causing that. I think it might be a dearth of consumer demand. Like if consumers had more money, if we had a basic income, that kind of thing, then that would inspire companies to produce more goods and services for the consumers, or invest in developing new goods and services, or producing more goods and services, that kind of thing. If you're at war, then the government is your consumer. So the creativity is inspired by the demand. So the war creates demand for investment of all different kinds. And I think you could also create that demand through a basic income and ensuring consumers have more money to spend, and that would inspire creativity too. When it's profitable to be creative, then you're going to be more creative. Yeah, Eddie, go ahead.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with what Alex is saying there. And to add to that, yeah, I was about to say what Alex was going to say, and take my point. So let me add to that, which is that it has to do with the balance of capital in society, and what many people call the working class. If you think about the fact that society's production, it is produced by a mixture of labor and capital. Those things are both required to make production. And the more capital you have in the mix, the less labor is required as your labor productivity growth goes up. And so I think that the reason that we're in the situation where consumers they don't have money to spend on more goods and services, and as a result, companies look around and they see no demand for new products, and they see no reason, they see nothing to invest in, because people can't buy any new goods and services. I think that is a result of the increase of capital in society, to the point where you are competing away the income that people can get by being a worker, by earning their job, by selling their labor.
Yeah, I like that. Bethany, go ahead.
So this is in response to your point about innovation, and I guess I was just thinking that some of what war gets you, or the Cold War gets you, might not be solved by basic income, because it might be these sort of investments by the government in long-term kinds of or riskier technological innovations that may or may not pan out. And I know sometimes in war these get to be really crazy and really risky, like mind control or something like that. But also you get things that are not going to pay off in the markets very quickly, or might be unlikely to pay off, but they're invested in because it's worth it for the government to do that under these kinds of circumstances. So I think you would still need something else to replace that besides just people with their everyday individual cash, because it's a different kind of incentive that's needed there.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. There are other incentives besides just higher demand that war provides, and ideally we would want to figure out a way to replace those incentives with something that's not so wasteful or destructive. Yeah. Anyone have any thoughts on what we could do? Yeah, Derek.
Well,
Space colonization.
Okay. I was thinking we could just go to war with Mars. Go ahead, Martin.
yeah, no, so I was just to your point, Alex, on the demand side of the sort of maybe creativity gap is there's a little bit of a chicken and an egg kind of conundrum there.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. So chicken and egg in the sense that so chicken and egg in the sense that if you had the demand, it would spur more industry, which would create more demand. Is that what you're saying?
So what I'm saying is that the creativity deficit, if that's what stock buybacks is revealing, or at least hinting at, is that there's always this back and forth between the creativity creating its own demand by discovery, you might say. So discovering a demand that nobody knew was there until the creativity created the product or service and then there was a demand for it. And I was sort of thinking, I don't know if this is a good to offer this, but I was sort of thinking of Uber. Uber's, if you're in a 1973 oil crisis embargo, and you want to encourage carpooling. A few decades later, Uber is sort of carpooling on steroids, but that poses a threat to the taxi industry that is built in large measure on very expensive medallions that fund the public government sector funding. And so again, I'm not sort of pointing fingers. I'm just sort of saying, here you have that chicken and egg thing kind of going on where you want to spur demand, and certainly putting sort of money in people's pocket. UBI becomes a mechanism by which there is then the money to fuel that demand. But it's not simply that. Sometimes the creativity side creates its own demand, and then on the consuming side, consumers figure out how to either reassign or to somehow increase their capacity, maybe borrowing, maybe working harder to get that next promotion. That's all I'm saying. Is it's not one-sided. It's just sort of back and forth and a little bit of a conundrum there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. I also think it's true that if people just don't have the money, then there's not much of an incentive to come up with things that they might want to buy that they don't even know they want to buy yet, right? Like if people have money everywhere, then businesses are going to be like, man, I want to come up with a really good product that people need, but they don't even know they need yet, or something like that. And I think basic income does help with that. It ensures that consumers do have the spending money. Maybe there's other ways to inspire more creativity too, but like I said before, I think people become more creative when it becomes more profitable to be creative. So let's go to Avi.
Yeah.
Or yeah, let's go to Avi.
Yeah, and I mean, even from the side of the government, what you could do is you could offer like prize money through competition just to encourage various creative pursuits. Like I know they've done this with space exploration, where they used to have space shuttles, but now they just offer contracts to whoever can make the best shuttle, and that seems to be the best solution in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think sometimes the market offers the prize all on its own. Sometimes the customer in the market is the government. So what you're talking about is the government wants to buy something, and then the market forces kind of bid to compete for that something. Let's go to Eddie.
So one really interesting thing there is, prior to Keynes, the classical economics was Say's law, and the idea was that supply creates its own demand. If you think about, if you ignore money for a second and think about like a barter situation, if I create something and I put it on the market, then I'm going to be putting it on the market to trade it for something else. So that would make Say's law true because I produce something, and I'm going to have to demand something to trade it away. And I would argue that, when you put money back into the equation on an overall level, this is actually like Say's law is actually true to some degree, in that, if tomorrow, everybody woke up and all of their bank accounts just, doubled, you'd have too much money, chasing too few goods, and prices would kind of double and equilibrate, and you'd end up with the same situation, just with double the prices, and double the wages and everything else. But the place where it breaks down, the only way that you could have, Keynes' paradox of thrift, what really is happening is not that there's not enough money in the economy per se, but that the money is in the wrong places, that the money is concentrated at the top. So all the capitalists, they have plenty of money. They could build, great big factories. But it goes back to that quote from Alan Watts, that analogy from Alan Watts, where he talks about the businessman. He builds a grand, automated factory, lays off all his workers, and then he turns around and there's no one to buy his goods and services anymore. That's exactly what what happens is you have too much capital, too much money, too much purchasing power available to purchase capital to invest, but the consumers don't have enough money in the pocket, and so as a result, any factories that you would build would just go idle. So people don't build factories; they just they make bubbles in the financial markets instead.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's a way to give people money that just causes prices to go up, and then there's a way to give people money that causes output to go up, and it depends on how it's distributed. Are you just giving the people with capital more money to buy more capital, or are you giving money to consumers so that capital can be activated and actually produce things for those consumers? And that has a very different effect on prices and a very different effect on output. We actually had a whole discussion at Boston Basic Income on Say's law. If you're curious, you can go back and watch that. But I like to say that basic income, if you calibrate it to the natural level that the economy can sustain, that it makes Say's law true. Because if supply isn't creating enough demand, then that means all you have to do is increase the basic income, and then you're giving money to consumers so they can actually activate that capacity. They can activate the full supply that's available to them. So yeah, let's go to Bethenny.
Yeah, my thought was just a little bit in response to what Avi was talking about the competitions, which do seem like a good idea. But I guess the thing I was thinking of that's difficult is that something like a war or a Cold War gives the government the incentive to invest money in those kinds of projects in the first place, whether it be through a market competition or participating in the markets or just like funding research directly or whatever. And part of that, of course, is like the political will gets behind it and sees the value of it, where it can be harder for the general public to see the value of these kinds of longer term investments. And there's other reasons too, but I guess I just wanted to say, like, that seems like the hardest problem, in some ways the hardest problem to solve, is like, without something like a war or Cold War, how do you get the proper investment in sort of long-term things, which I guess we're also seeing with the pandemic issue. Like, it comes along unpredictably, yada yada, but it's like a really big deal when it happens. And so it does make sense to put money into sort of dealing with it or having the capacity for it or preventing it, but it's very hard to get the political will behind that most of the time. So I think that's kind of a similar problem with incentives, like government incentives.
Yeah, I think that's right. How do you get government to invest in the future? How do you get people to invest in the future?
Yeah.
You know, yeah. And I think this is one of those problems where you know, you'd want the government to represent the interests of the people by investing, even though it's not necessarily what the people would ask for on their own. That kind of thing. I mean, the role of government, of course, is to represent the collective interest of the people when their individual self-interest is not going to cut it. So the times when individual self-interest is not going to provide the benefit that they need. But of course, sometime, you know, most of the time, or maybe a lot of the time, you know, every individual can see what they would want society to collectively do to benefit them. They can see what they would want the government to do that would collectively benefit everyone, even though individually they would not, you know, kind of come together and contribute to it on their own. But this is one of those times where maybe that's not the case, where they can't, you know, see the potential benefit. They want something right now collectively instead of something in the future collectively. So it's a tricky problem. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess I just think it's really highlighted by the fact that even though war investment is about the current war, it ends up being so much money thrown at technological innovation that we often end up with these things like GPS that are really great for the civilian economy. It's not even targeted towards that. You know, imagine if it were that we had that much sort of targeted towards something that was actually for the civilian economy. But it's just very difficult, for the reasons you and I are saying, to get the interest in that to happen, I think, a lot of the time.
Yeah, and I wonder if something like, you know, going to Mars, or these kind of like really observable kind of achievements can maybe serve that role or something like that. Like, as a society, you know, humanity is endeavoring to do X, and then as a side effect, we're investing in all these things that benefit people's ordinary lives that maybe we wouldn't have done if we weren't, you know, reaching for the stars or whatever, right? So maybe that's something.
That could help.
Scientific progress, you know, I don't know. You just really like the conspicuous obvious things might motivate the less obvious but still beneficial things.
And those could have an element, like we're talking about, of like competition, even if you're not like in a Cold War, just like you want to be the country that like goes there first. Although now obviously we need collaborations across countries, so you don't really even get that benefit.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So let's go to the next quote. Share. Here we go. Since economically war is a waste, and it wastes existing, not future manpower, capital goods, and raw materials, it is clear that the real cost of waging war is borne by the living, who are deprived of things that in the absence of war could be produced and consumed in ordinary peacetime life. No amount of fiscal hocus pocus can change that reality. And I think this is true. This is true if we have a basic income, if the economy is already doing the things that it's supposed to be doing. If it's not, like in today's economy, then we can use all kinds of fiscal hocus pocus to actually make the war benefit people more than they would have in peacetime. Yeah. Does anyone have any comments on that, or we can move to the next one? Let's move to the next one.
Just while you're moving, my 2 cents is,
Yeah.
if you have enough losses in war of male population, you could argue there's a you know, population cost, and that's why some countries are sensitive to whether their population is growing or contracting, and you don't see it as much in this country, but look at the demographic sort of planning and discussion that you might see in Russia and that you see in China.
Yep. Yep. And then you see places like Japan or South Korea where they're trying to get people to have children because their populations are shrinking or getting too old and stuff like that. All right, here we go. The method the United States has used to finance its wars in this century has been mixed. To a limited degree, it has taken purchasing power from the citizenry by taxation and by the non-inflationary sale of bonds paid for by genuine saving of funds that otherwise would have been spent on consumers' goods or invested directly or indirectly in capital goods. So I think this is, we've kind of talked about this a little bit before, that the war bonds in World War II, it's largely to get people to buy that instead of buying consumer goods, so that it frees up resources to go to the war. I think, his idea that levying taxes or borrowing, against real resources or something like that is non-inflationary. I think it's a little bit trickier than that, because if you are well, partly because the economy was not fully activated previously, but what was I going to say? Okay, non-inflationary sale of bonds paid for by genuine saving of funds that would otherwise have been spent on consumer goods. Okay, so I think the idea that just because you're doing taxes, you're preventing the inflation, I think is wrong. It depends on what you're taxing. So I like to say that if you're taking money away from rich people who weren't going to spend their money on consumer goods anyway, then that doesn't really free up resources that could be going to consumer goods, or it doesn't necessarily free up resources that could be going toward war. So there's not this like one-to-one correspondence between the tax revenues that's collected and what the government can spend money on, whether that's consumer goods or war goods. And that's true for borrowing too. I think it's definitely true that if you're selling war bonds that people are buying instead of consumer goods, that's allowing the government to put more resources toward the war. But it's not a one-to-one thing. Neither one of these things is a one-to-one thing. And you need to be careful with, especially with something like taxation, where depending on what you tax, if you're taxing economic activity and disincentivizing certain things, that actually might reduce the amount of resources that are available, either to go to consumers or to go to the war. So I think this perspective of the pure right way, simple way to do it is to match it up with taxes and kind of genuine saving of funds, that kind of thing. It's more complicated than that. So I guess that's the only real comment I have on that one. Anyone have any thoughts? We can go to the next one. All right. It would be naive indeed to suppose that any government, particularly a government strongly influenced by union leadership and economists sympathetic to the welfare state, would have the moral courage and intellectual integrity to tell its people that war, however necessary politically, is economic waste that must be paid for out of current production, and that it would be wise and fair to collect the money cost at the same time that men are being sent to death or permanent injuries. Individuals have to discover these harsh facts for themselves. So this again is about the idea of kind of hiding the true cost of the war in inflation, or through printing money instead of taxing people, that kind of thing. Yeah, go ahead, Bethenny.
Yeah, I guess I just wasn't sure that why he thought this was politically one side or the other. It kind of seems like any politician would want to hide the cost. He's emphasizing like certain political groups, but it's not clear to me why he's doing that. I guess maybe you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are political groups, especially anti-war political groups, that are very much pro taxation for war. Like war should be funded entirely through taxes, that kind of thing, to just make it obvious to people. And I think that's what he wants too. He wants people to see the cost of the war. And I think he's thinking that there are some political groups or political leanings that would prefer to hide that cost and show that, you know, the welfare state is benefiting people and that kind of thing. Yeah, Bethenny.
I guess I just maybe incorrectly associate different political positions together. Like he sort of seems to be describing the left more than the right. And I tend to associate them with being less interested in going to war, but maybe that's a naive view or a view that didn't hold when he was writing the article. It's not a super important point, but it just seemed
Yeah.
odd to me that he was associating those things.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's revealing a little bit about his own politics here.
I was wondering, yeah.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure.
I think that's true. You know, I don't think he's, you know, like, and he even says in the article he's not like, you know, a pacifist or something like that. And you would kind of associate wanting to lay bare the costs of a war with kind of a more pacifist agenda. But also just, you know, wanting to make the right calculations of when to go to war, you know, seeing the real cost, that kind of thing. I just don't think it's as simple as like make it all taxes and then it works. It might be a little bit simpler in a world with basic income, because then literally you're having to tax the resource usage and reduce the amount of private, you know, private sector, domestic consumer resources that people are able to take advantage of, and that's more explicit.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would say the first step, as is the first step to everything, the first step is basic income, and then you go from there, and a lot of these other things start to get a lot simpler. Yeah. So let's do one more. Let's see. Yeah, not that one. Where's the one where he talks about 1990? Well, let's do this one. There was a good quote where he talks about, you know, the people in 1996 can't be fighting the war or paying for the war. I thought I selected that one somewhere, but we'll look at this one for now. So the major source of funding for the war has been a thinly disguised printing of money. There has been nothing as blatant or as naive as the printing of continentals or greenbacks. There are more subtle ways, especially since the United States abandoned commodity money. When citizens cannot freely exchange banknotes for gold, they can do nothing effective to prevent the Treasury and the Fed from forcing commercial banks to buy engraved pieces of paper for which they pay with a credit against which the government can write checks. So clearly he has some opinions about the gold standard, and he's not a fan of continentals or greenbacks, which are the fiat currencies that were issued during the Revolutionary War and then during the Civil War. Yeah, Steve, go ahead. Don't forget to unmute yourself.
Steve, we
Okay.
can't hear you. You're muted.
Yeah, he's got it.
I'm here now. Am I?
Yep, you're
Yes.
good. Okay. The engraved pieces of paper, is he referring to currency or to Treasury securities?
I think he's referring to currency at this point, but he could be referring to either. And I think, you know, the two things are kind of comparable to each other.
FYI, Elizabeth found your other quote and it's in the chat if you want to find it.
Oh yeah, there it is. It is, thanks Elizabeth. It is as impossible to shift the material costs to the taxpayers of 1996 as it is to shift the burden of combat to the youngsters who will be of military age in 1996. Only men now living, and only capital goods and materials now in being can be employed to wage war in Vietnam in 1966. There is no way to borrow them from the future. So I think that's basically right, and I really like his way of putting this. I would say that to some extent you can borrow from the future in the sense that you can borrow from other countries and then kind of pay them back in the future. for certain resources. You can say, okay, everybody, you know, like once we win this war, we'll pay you back, that kind of thing. And I mentioned that earlier, but I think generally speaking, this is not emphasized enough, that you know, maybe you had some savings from the past that you can make use of now. And maybe you can invest now for wars in the future, but any investment you make now that's not for the immediate war is taking resources away from the immediate war, that kind of thing. Yeah, Bethenny.
Yeah, I think I generally agree with this, but I just was also thinking that we presumably, if we're not being totally crazy, always have at least a little bit of a buffer where we're not, like, even with the basic income, we might not be at max capacity to try to make things more sustainable. And I imagine in a crisis, whether it be this crisis, like with a pandemic or a war, you sort of let that go. Like you use all the resources, including the ones you would usually like save to make things more sustainable, because it just feels like there's more at stake in whether you use them right now. And so I think that's a marginal part of what kind of like pays for the war. But in that sense, you are kind of borrowing against the future in real resource terms. Like maybe you won't have as much stuff left over in the future that you usually would if you're trying to, and if it's a renewable resource, maybe all the more so. Like if you just need a lot of wood for some reason, we probably wouldn't, but you know, if you cut down all your forests and like don't replant them fast enough, or you know, whatever, right? So you could imagine, like, obviously we could in a war, we might make climate change really, really like way worse than we otherwise would. So there are ways in which we might be like trying to keep things sustainable and not being at max production that would go away and borrow against the future, even with a basic income, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. You know, all notions of sustainability go out the window if you need to win a war. Steve, do you have your hand up again, or is that from before? I guess that's from before. Let's go to Derek.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of what was just said. I like that the 1996 quote, because he's making again this point that we're not borrowing money from the future, we're spending resources today. But this article is really fascinating to me because there's such a disconnect between, in my view, between that and where he ends up with in his solution. He sort of makes printing money the villain of his story. And he assumes also that like the total quantity of this printing causes a problem. And then somehow he assumes that gold has anything to do with solving this problem. And I love at the end, he throws up as this kind of moral paragon, you know, Napoleon, who promised to pay cash and, you know, it's on the gold standard. But then, you know, I did some research on that, and that what that means is he promises that 1/3 of the notes in circulation are backed by gold. So the question is, well, what's the other 2/3 backed by? And it's fascinating to me that he, on some level, he can be so in tune with the real resource costs and putting the emphasis on that. But at the same time, the champion, the savior for that problem isn't printing money in a better way or a more useful way. It's telling a story about how real money is backed by gold and the other money is not.
Yeah, I found that really interesting too. And maybe part of the way to reconcile that, at least in his psychology, is that he wants the money that's out there to represent actual stuff. Like he wants the two things to correspond with each other. Whereas, you know, when we talk about like consumer monetary theory and stuff like that, we talk about, you know, just the flow of production and the flow of spending, and then the quantities can be whatever they want to be, where they want to be, as long as those flows kind of match up. So he's trying to match things up. He's just not necessarily matching the right things up, is what I think. Eddie, go ahead.
So I would say that we can borrow from the future as a society, and the way that that happens is that you know, there's a certain capital base, you know, a physical capital base, and that physical capital base also has maintenance costs. It needs to be maintained to some degree every year. And so, as a society, you know, if you're spending, you know, all the money you can on a war, and you're letting your physical capital base, you know, kind of degrade over time, and not spending on the maintenance costs, then you are borrowing from the future, because your productive capacity is going to, you know, degrade, is going to go down in the future due to that. And that's true, you know, all the way across the spectrum. Where you say, if you were, you know, complete pacifist and, you know, protected by heaven or something, and you didn't spend anything on war, and assuming that you have UBI in place and people can consume all the production of society, you could invest all of it into more physical capital, into more technology, science, more productive capacity, and that would give you a better quality of life in the future. So.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and I think this is similar to the point that Bethenny was making about using unsustainable activities to make things happen now, because you're in a time of war. So then maybe that's kind of borrowing against the future. That's like allowing your capital to degrade. And I think that's kind of the same concept there. So yeah, I think that's definitely true. So let's go to our final quote. Let's see. Yeah, here we go. This is from the end of the article. So when the first great European coalition was formed against the empire, Napoleon was hard pressed financially, and it was proposed to resort to paper money. But he wrote to his minister, "While I live, I will never resort to irredeemable paper." He never did, and France, under this determination, commanded all the gold she needed. Apparently that's 1/3 of backing everything. But yeah, when Waterloo came, with the invasion of the Allies, with the war on her own soil, with a change of dynasty, and with heavy expenses for the war and indemnities, France, on a specie basis, experienced no severe financial distress. So I guess it was the case that having a third of the currency backed by gold was enough in this case. It was enough to survive losing a war and still being okay. But then the question is, well, if they hadn't done that, if Napoleon hadn't done that and said, hey, I'm going to issue more currency, would he have lost the war, right? Would he have been able to pull more resources in and end up winning the war? And I think a lot of countries and a lot of times and places in history have decided that's the way they want to go, because it increases the chance of winning the war, even though it increases the cost of losing the war. So that's kind of my thought on that one. Let's go around and get final thoughts. We'll start with Bethenny since she has her hand up, and then we'll go Eddie, Martin, Derek.
Okay, well, I guess just my quick thought on that, and then I'll give my final thoughts. But I was just curious. So first of all, Napoleon might have been special, first because they might have been taking a lot of gold from other places that they still had, I don't know. And second, because I know he commanded like a bizarre amount of loyalty from a lot of soldiers. I don't know if he was always paying these soldiers, but when he came back from Elba, he managed to raise his army like all over again, and he probably didn't have to pay them right away. Things like that might have been sort of unrepresentative about that situation. Overall, I thought this was a really interesting discussion. I think the example of war really clarifies the difference between problems of not having the demand driven by money and problems of actual resources, especially, again, the example of people thinking sometimes that a war can actually pull you out of something like a depression, even though it's just a burning of resources relative to before. And I like how clear the article was on some of that stuff. So thanks.
Great, thanks, Bethenny. Let's go to Eddie, and then Martin, and then Derek, and then Elizabeth, and then my mom, and then Steve.
So I think of the gold standard as the pre-20th century, pre-21st century version of Bitcoin's 21 million cap on quantity. I think that it is just an interesting, the historical way that governments and kings could be limited in terms of how much productive capacity they could co-opt, by using money, because they could not, produce, they could print more money, but they can't come up with more gold, more physical gold. So I think that the author's point is that, again, that printing money in many times and places is kind of a stealth tax, sneaky way where the populace and the populace generally thinks of money as a hard standard, as something that is not going to change over time. But if the money, if the monarch or the government gets in a tight spot and they say, we really need to, use more resources, the consequences be damned. They can print, 50% more money, and they can, for a short period of time, co-op lots of resources, but also create lots of bad consequences down the road for everybody in society.
Yep. All right, Martin, you're up.
Yeah, so I think that this the topic was
So you're breaking up, Martin.
very useful from a
Oh, there we go.
discussion. Am I back? So
You're back.
what I was saying is I think this discussion was very useful, very instructive, kind of from a learning point of view. And my only other thought is on Napoleon. Whatever he thought about gold, he probably more wishes he'd never invaded Spain. And had he committed his guard in the Battle of Borodino outside of Moscow, the Russians may have never burned Moscow to the ground and starving the Grande Armée and leading to its ultimate destruction, and a few years later, coughing up the ghost at Waterloo.
All right, there you go. Derek, go ahead.
I think this is a really good topic, and I thought this was a really interesting article. I agree so much with what I think the author lays out as his goal, and agree with his descriptions of the problems of war spending. What I'd want to ask him is what he thinks really, if his solution, if a gold standard is a good solution to preventing this kind of wasteful spending, because I think we've seen over and over that when we try to use an artificial restraint, right, to reel in government spending, whether that's a gold standard or whether that's just kind of worrying about the national debt, when a war happens, the government will wasteful spend as much as it wants on these activities. And it always comes back to, well, what is the real constraint? And so I think that shows that what crowds out other spending, it's not gold, it's not the national debt, it's other spending. And so really the question is, if we want less war spending, we shouldn't be trying to take out that spending. We should be asking, what should we be spending on instead? And I think basic income is a great answer to that question.
I love it. Elizabeth, go ahead.
I guess sort of related to some of Derek's points, I thought it was interesting in the conversation thinking about the ways in which war isn't necessarily wasteful, that it like spurs innovation, the sort of like generative stuff that comes out of that. And so thinking sort of both sides of like, okay, so then how can we do that in a non-war economy is sort of the flip side of like, oh, okay, all the stuff that we're wasting in a war, how could we utilize that in a non-war economy, which is sort of Derek's point. So.
Yeah. Let's go to Mom. If you're there.
Unmuting.
All right.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Okay. Well, I'm here, but I'm just going to say thanks. I had a lot to think about and learn. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Yeah. You can watch this on YouTube if you want.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Steve.
Maybe the pandemic will cause some positives that will last into the future. A lot more people are like poor people now, and they go to the store, they can't buy what they want. They can't get the medical care that they'd assumed that they could get before. They might even know what violent inner cities neighborhoods are like, because they're starting to lose more friends and acquaintances than they're used to. So if people remember how this is and have some empathy, then maybe something positive can come out of this.
Yeah, I certainly hope so. So this is a great discussion. Thanks, guys. Next week, we're going to be back, and we're going to be talking about Baumol's cost disease, which is, so there's economist William Baumol, and basically his idea is that as workers get more productive in some sectors, it pulls up wages everywhere. And then the result is that more labor intensive goods get more expensive, and less labor intensive goods, or more, goods where people are more productive, get less expensive. So we're going to talk about that, and I will defy anyone to connect that to coronavirus. So thanks, guys.